afternoon, students, and welcome to today's lecture on the spaces and places associated with ancient Greek sport. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to be looking beyond the events of ancient athletics to the locations in which they took place. Now, to get your brain juices flowing, think about this. So, here at the University of Arizona, the men's and women's basketball teams play at the McHale Center, which holds almost 15,000 fans. And it provides one of the best, craziest game day experiences anywhere in the country. But the basketball court at your local rec center is exactly the same. 94 feet long, 50 feet wide, with a 10-foot high basket on each side. Now, for the purposes of the game itself, it's no different whatsoever. But the experiences that happen within those spaces vary immensely, both because of the nature of the events, a Pac-12 game versus your local pickup game, and because of the space itself. The lights, the cameras, the jumbotrons, the food stands, and the seating. And in this lecture, we'll take a look at what these spaces were like in antiquity. And in doing so, we'll start to think about how the spaces impacted the experience, both for the athletes and for the spectators. So, whether you're here to witness greatness, or just want a hot dog, peanuts, and an ice cold beer, journey with me as we investigate ancient athletic infrastructure. Okay, so let's get one thing straight. If you learned about ancient athletics from a single lecture in a much larger, broader class on Greek culture, there'd probably be two things you'd hear about when it comes to sports structures. Hippodromes are for the equestrian events, and the stadion, or the stadium, is for everything else. And for the most part, that's kinda sorta true. But in today's lecture, we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into the physical structures associated with ancient Greek sport. And in doing so, we'll find that that's not always the case. Okay, so when it comes to ancient Greek athletics, which mainly consists of running and jumping and throwing things and fighting and, horse racing too, you don't really need a structure to do those things. Just some open space for the event, and maybe a little extra space for spectators and things like that. And in many cases, in the ancient Greek world, that's exactly what you get. So let's take Olympia, for example. According to the ancient author Xenophon, the combat sports in the Olympic Games, boxing and wrestling and the Pancration, all those took place not in the stadium, but rather in the sacred religious precinct known as the Altis. Elsewhere, city-states would use the agora, the Greek term for the word marketplace, as the location for athletic or even equestrian events. And scholars have suggested that Athens itself may have used the agora for sports in its earlier days. And the city-state of Elis, which organized the Olympic Games every 4 years, appears to have used its agora for horse racing, since it didn't have a hippodrome. It seems a little wild that a commercial or political center could be configured or reconfigured for chaotic horse and chariot racing. But you've got to keep in mind that many of these structures would have been temporary edifices made out of wood, so easy to assemble and disassemble and reassemble to facilitate these various configurations. Now, many places didn't bother with any sort of physical structure at all. So for example, on the sacred island of Delos, horse races just took place in an open field on the north end of the island. And the same thing in early Athens, where Xenophon mentions it was just an open field without any barriers, and random people and military training, they'd often get caught in the middle of these races and get in the way of things. Can you imagine going out for a nice walk in the field and then getting trampled by a chariot race? I guess that's why they did build hippodromes later on. All right, now anyone who's played competitive sports knows that you don't just show up on game day. You gotta practice. Well, unless you're Allen Iverson, I guess.
We sitting here, I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice. I mean, listen, we're talking about practice. Not a game. We talking about practice. Not a game. Not the game that I go out there and die for and play every game like it's my last. Not the game. We're talking about practice, man. I mean, how silly is that, man? We're talking about practice.
And the Greeks were no different here. The main place for athletic training in the ancient Greek city-states was called the Gymnasion. That's where we get our word gymnasium. And very literally, in the ancient Greek language, the term gymnasion translates as the place for nude exercise. And indeed, much of the training that took place in these structures was actually in the nude. And we'll hear more about the role of nudity, both in training, but also in ancient Greek athletics more broadly later in the course. But rather than a single structure, the ancient Greek gymnasia, that's the plural of gymnasion, were really a collection of athletic spaces and structures. So first we've got the tracks, and we call a track a dromos, or dromoi in the plural in Greek. And these would have been used for practicing and running and throwing. When the space was available, there were two of these tracks, and one was actually covered with a roof, the other one was open to the sky. And here we can see the dramatically situated gymnasion at the site of Delphi. And here we see the space both for the covered track and for the uncovered track, as well as the archaeological remains of a rectangular palaestra far in the distance. If you're gonna work out, why not work out with an awesome view? Now, the other primary structure at the gymnasion was called the palaestra, which literally translates as the place for wrestling. The palaestra was a smaller rectangular space, and it had more of a built structure than either of the tracks. There would have been an open courtyard in the center, a shaded area under a colonnade, and then rooms spreading out from around the colonnade towards the outside. It was here that the Greeks would practice combat sports, boxing and wrestling in the Pankration. Now, over here, we can see the archaeological remains of the palaestra at the site of Olympia. The grassy area in the middle would have remained open, while the walkway to the side of the columns would have been shaded. The rooms then split off from the shaded colonnade. Fun fact, the University of Pennsylvania's basketball arena is actually called the Palaestra. It's almost 100 years old, and it's sometimes called the Cathedral of college basketball. Now, over time, the gymnasia actually took more diverse roles. So moving from a place of just physical education to really education more broadly. They became key locales for philosophical discussion. And the gymnasia in Athens, well, it actually became more famous for their links to philosophy than to their connection to athletics. So the academy, right, Plato's academy, of course, became inextricably bound to the philosopher Plato, while the Lyceum became inextricably bound to the philosopher Aristotle. So, the gymnasia and the palaestrae, right, these might seem like ancillary structures, paling in comparison to the grand stadia and hippodromes of the Greek world. But let's put this in perspective. So, few people in the ancient Greek world would have had the athletic talent to actually participate in the Olympics, or in really any of the Panhellenic games. Yet the gymnasia and the palaestri found in the city-states throughout the Greek world, they would have been used by the vast majority of the male population for physical fitness and competition and education. And these were arguably the most important sporting structures in the ancient Greek world. All right, now while daily athletic training took place within the gymnasia and the palaestri of the ancient Greek city-states, official competitions, whether they're Pan-Hellenic or civic in nature, often took place within a stadium, called a stadion in Greek, or stadia in the plural. We'll use the term stadium today so we can differentiate it from the distance and race which shared the same name, stadion. These ancient Greek stadia were rectangular in nature, and they were about 600 feet long, a distance known as a stadion. But perhaps surprisingly, the distance of a foot, right, one of those 600 feet, wasn't very standardized in the ancient Greek world. So stadia in different parts of the Greek world were noticeably different lengths. Okay, so like the stadium at Olympia here, right, that's 192 meters in modern meters in length. But the stadium at Delphi was only 177 meters in length. So not massively different, but certainly different enough that you could tell a difference. Now the track at the stadium, it sloped very slightly from end to end so that water would run off into these channels framed in on the side. Now at one end of the stadium, we've got the starting line, known as the balbus in Greek. These were usually marble blocks that were actually set into the ground, with a small groove in them where runners would place their toes. The blocks also contained a small socket for a wooden post, and these posts were part of a starting mechanism called a hisplex. This contraption functioned kind of along the same lines as a catapult, so that when the lever was pressed or pulled, the gates would open for all competitors at exactly the same time. And that would ensure both a fair start to the race, and it would also prevent any subjective accusations of false starts at against the competitors in the race itself. Now, at the other end of the stadium here, we've got the turning posts. Rather than race around a curved track like we do today, athletes in antiquity would make a sharp turn around a post and then try to make it back to the original starting line. Now, as time went on, athletic competitions became more and more popular, and the physical facilities became more and more complex. So in the 4th century AD, a special entrance was added to several of the Pan-Hellenic stadia. These were vaulted tunnels at one end of the stadium, and only the athletes themselves were allowed to use them to enter the space. And this kind of further divided the kind of division between athlete and spectator at these games. So over here, we can see part of the vaulted tunnel at the site of Olympia. And here we can see the vault at the site of Nevaeh, and it's even better preserved. The Nemean entrance vault holds another secret, an incredibly well-preserved locker room called the apoditerion in Greek. Athletes would have used this space to undress, right? Not dress because they were doing this in the nude, so they'd actually use the space to undress and prepare prior to competing in their events. So while the ancient Greek stadium may appear simple compared to modern athletic venues, the track and the entrance tunnel and the locker room combination was a remarkably well-developed set of structures in antiquity. Now, most of the events at the major sets of games took place within the stadia. We just talked about, right? The foot races and the throwing events like the discus and the javelin, and sometimes, but not always, the combat sports, boxing, wrestling, pankration. And they all would have taken place in this space, in the stadium. But despite the elongated shape of the stadium, the ancient Greek stadium wasn't large enough to hold any of the equestrian or the horse-related sports, namely horse racing and chariot racing. These equestrian events would have taken place in something known as a hippodrome. Very literally the horse track. Not the most creative name, but there you go. Now, we saw earlier in this lecture that hippodromes were frequently just set up temporarily in open fields on the edges of a polis or city-state. And this makes sense given that these were huge structures, almost twice as long as a stadium and more than twice as wide. And it would have taken a considerable amount of resources to build and maintain a permanent structure. But the other implication of this is somewhat counterintuitive. These structures were huge, but because they were so big, they didn't actually build much of a physical structure. It was a space more than anything. And because there isn't much of a physical structure, these can actually be awfully difficult to find and identify archaeologically. Even though they're the biggest, they're kind of the most difficult to identify. Now, Olympia and Delphi both serve as great examples here. We know from the historical record and from the lists and stories of all the events and winners at the Panhellenic Games that these sites definitely held permanent hippodromes for horse and chariot racing. Yet, up until the start of the 21st century, scholars hadn't identified these structures. Now, recently, there have been claims that the locations of the hippodromes have been discovered underneath the olive groves that dot these landscapes. But honestly, these discoveries, they're still debated by scholars in the field. Now, there's only one clear, unambiguous Greek hippodrome that's been conclusively identified, and that's at the site of Mount Lycaon in the central Peloponnese. The site itself is being excavated by the University of Arizona. And from these, as well as from some previous excavations, we can learn a few things about the nature of the hippodrome. So first, it was semicircular in nature. It was curved on the far end of the track and flat at the starting and finishing end. You'd start and finish around the same place. The hippodrome at Lycaon is approximately 320 meters long by about 140 meters wide, so significantly larger than the stadium. Which, a rather unique circumstance, actually housed inside the hippodrome at the site. Right? So it's kind of weird. The actual stadium at Lycaon is built inside the hippodrome. Kind of strange. The original excavator found that out because they discovered the stone starting blocks in the center of the hippodrome, suggesting that the foot races would have actually taken place in the middle of the thing. Now, other depictions and descriptions of hippodromes indicated that there were turning posts on each of the long ends of the track. These were known as termi, and they were the most dangerous points in the race because they had to create these hairpin turns around which the chariots had to go. Now, there were often crashes, often painful, sometimes deadly crashes. And in acknowledgement of this danger, an altar to Tarex Zippus, the terrifier of horses, was set up in this location within the hippodromes. Now, we can't leave our discussion of the hippodrome without talking about the starting mechanism. Much like the hisplex, which was used to ensure that runners started at the same time in the foot races, the hippodrome had its own mechanical starting process. The Greco-Roman historian Pausanias describes the mechanism at Olympia. It was a long cable, more than 400 feet long, and it prevented the chariots from leaving early. Then, on one side of the track, there was a large prow of a ship, right, the front of a ship with a bronze dolphin on it. And on the other side of the track, there was an altar with a bronze eagle on it. And at the start of the race, the bronze dolphin would descend as though diving into the water, and this would lift up the bronze eagle on the other side. And at the same time this was happening, the cables would begin to drop, the cables which held back the chariots. And this would allow the horses actually on the outside to leave first, and then the next farthest horses, and then finally the farthest horses like to the center, right? So the ones that had to go the least distance. So this thing was staggered just like a modern foot race on a curved track. Now, the inventor of this contraption, a guy by the name of Cleotus, he was so proud of his invention that he had it inscribed on a statue base in Athens. So it's a statue of him and it says, "The first inventor of the starting mechanism for horses at Olympia made me. Cleotas, son of Aristocles." Now, as the games went on, they grew significantly in popularity. And while the Greek stadia never really gained the same type of stone spectator seating that Roman stadia had, there were nevertheless plenty of resources for those who attended the games. Now, some sites had guest houses for the athletes and judges who participated in the games. The Leonideion here at Olympia, for example, served just such a purpose. A really impressive building to host the athletes and judges who participated in the Olympic Games. But in large part, visitors would have just set up tents or other temporary structures somewhere out in the fields. So you can see this kind of nice bucolic landscape really coming alive during the period of the games. So I really like the way that one scholar from the British Museum puts this. He does a great job of describing the kind of beautiful and chaotic transformation at the games. So he writes, "The princes and tyrants of Sicily and southern Italy would have sailed up the river in splendid barges, ambassadors from various towns vying with each other in dress and paraphernalia. The rich came on horseback and in chariots. The poor came on donkeys, in carts and even on foot. Food sellers came loaded with supplies, for there was no town near Olympia. Merchants flocked in with their wares. Artisans came to make figurines that pilgrims could buy and offer to their god. Booths and stalls were set up. Tents and huts were erected. For only official delegates were given accommodation in the magnificent guest house known as the Leonideion. Most visitors looked for a suitable spot to put down their belongings and slept each night under the summer skies." Now, the seating at the games themselves was also similarly ephemeral. When we see the stone bleachers at sites like Delphi, we're looking at a much later addition to an earlier Greek stadium, a Roman addition to a Greek stadium. Instead, the stadia at sites like Olympia, over here, and sites like Nemea, over here, are much more representative of what stadia would have looked like during the classical period of Greek antiquity. Spectators would have spread out across the grassy banks surrounding the track with, really little official seating infrastructure. But nonetheless, the capacities were quite impressive. So a stadia like Olympia likely would have held something like 45,000 spectators. And the Hippodromes, because they were much larger in nature, could have held significantly more. Now, even though many of the spectators brought a tent to sleep in, the host city still had lots of planning to do. One of the most incredible inscriptions we have from antiquity comes from Delphi, right? And it shows everything that was needed, everything that had to happen in preparation for the Pythian Games. And we get everything from repairs to the Gymnasion, to the leveling of the stadium, to the purchase of prizes, to cleaning of a nearby spring. And what's even cooler is you get the cost of each one of these things. So in theory, you could calculate the cost for putting on the Pythian Games. And some of these rituals and prizes at these big sets of games were particularly expensive. So at the Olympics, for example, 100 oxen were sacrificed, quite the expenditure. And Athens had to procure a massive amount of olive oil as prizes during the Panathenaic Games. So these games could really get quite expensive. One of the coolest things about the athletic infrastructure of the ancient Greek world is how closely it parallels the style and scale of athletic infrastructure today. So Delphi over here was the smallest of the ancient Greek stadia. It sat around 6,500 fans, almost like a small hockey arena or something like that. But Nemea could have held about 40,000 spectators. Olympia could hold somewhere in the range of 45,000 attendees. And the Panathenaic Stadium in Athens, the only all-marble stadium in the world, could have held like 50,000 people. And current 21st century Pac-12 football stadiums are right in the same range here. So Washington State's could hold like 40,000. Utah's can hold like 45,000 people. Oregon State's is about the same there. Stanford Stadium can hold like 50,000 people. Colorado's is around 53,000, and the University of Arizona Stadium, right there, with a capacity of 56,000 fans. Now, the multi-purpose construction of the modern-day track and field strikes another impressive parallel with antiquity. The big difference, of course, is the rounded nature of the track, with the field forming the center of the structure. But just like ancient stadia, in which most of the non-equestrian events took place, the modern track and field looks simple, but it can actually host a huge array of events. So as you can see here, right, it can look pretty simple, but it has different starting points for a variety of the foot race distances, and it includes staggered starts for the mid-distance sprints. The field in the middle of this thing contains space for the throwing events, right? The shot put, the javelin, the discus, the hammer throw, those sorts of things. And each one of those has its own specific starting point and its own kind of field of play within that larger field. And a series of jumping related spaces allows for the high jump and the long jump and the broad jump and the triple jump and the pole vault and even the steeplechase. Now, the biggest differences between ancient and modern are perhaps related to the support infrastructure rather than the athletic infrastructure. No longer today are spectators bringing their own tents with them to attend the world's biggest sporting events. So, for the 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro, for example, right, Brazil constructed a whopping 422 new hotels. That's like more than 20,000 rooms. Athens, when it hosted the 2008 Olympics, redid its entire subway system. Beijing constructed some of the most memorable sporting venues with the Bird's Nest Stadium and the Water Cube Aquatic Center. And one need to only wander around the stadiums themselves to see how the vendors have transitioned from temporary carts and stands to super elaborate permanent structures. So while the games themselves hold kind of a familiar feel at their core, the surrounding infrastructure has exploded in recent years. All right, you've made it to the end of another episode. Today we've taken a look at the physical facilities, the actual spaces and places where ancient athletics took place. And we've seen, perhaps counterintuitively, that it was the everyday training places, right? The Gymnasia and the Palaestrae that were the true heart of athletics within the ancient Greek city-state. These were places that a huge swath of the population would have used, whereas only the elite would have participated in those Pan-Hellenic games. Those games, however, they grew in popularity over time, and the infrastructure of stadia and hippodromes and all the support facilities, they grew along with them. Nonetheless, there was a sense of kind of impermanence when it came to those facilities, especially the support facilities for spectators. Spectators often brought their own tents for lodging and sat on the kind of grassy embankments to watch the games in the stadium. So if you're headed to the Olympics, or at least if you're headed to the Olympics 2,500 years ago, don't forget to bring your tent. Just a couple lessons you can learn from ancient athletic infrastructure.